Wow, good stuff. We get to know God through His Word, and we also get to know ourselves and the devil. And I thought where we go tonight is let's go to Judges chapter. We're going to start in Judges chapter 8. I want to look at Judges chapter 8 and chapter 9. Really interesting record, and it's a record about a tumultuous time. And I think that as we enter in to 2000, as we ramp up for 2019, and there's a whole bunch of political infighting, as going on, and a lot at stake. And so God's at play, the devil's at play. And so it's good to be able to read records in the Bible and get more of a picture of what's going on, because here in Judges chapter 8, there are things that you see that kind of, and stuff may pop out at you that I may not see, or vice versa. But it starts with the record of Gideon and then goes to Gideon's son Abimelech. So I'm going to start in Judges chapter 8, verse 22. And it says, "Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, both you and your son's son also, for you have saved us out of the hand of Midian.'" Now, if you go back and you read the record of Gideon, the Israelites were enslaved by the Midianites, and it was Gideon who delivered them. And so now, as a result, the people come and they say, they recognize the Spirit of God working in Gideon. They also recognized his courage. And so they said to him, "Rule over us." And verse 23, Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you." And this sounds so cool. And this is what we would expect. And yet, watch what's going to happen here, because Gideon has the right idea, but he doesn't really have the strength of character to pull it off. And that's something a lot of times, it's one of the reasons we need the body. Because a lot of times, it's just like Paul in Romans 7, a lot of times we know what to do, but we don't have the strength of character to pull it off. And the best way to be able to accomplish good things that way is to find a couple people that are really good people that you can be really close to and really honest with, who won't condemn you for your shortcomings and your faults and that kind of thing, and that can then give you that support through the back door to just really help you manifest, the kind of person you need to be. So right after saying, Yahweh is going to rule over you, verse 24, Gideon said to them, "I have a request to request of you. Give me and every man of you an earring from his plunder." For they, that means the Midianites, had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. So the Midianites were related to the Ishmaelites, and they had one of their foibles was the men wore a gold earring. So fine. So he says, I want a gold earring from everybody. Verse 25, and of course, they answered, "We will give them to you. And, we'll willingly give them. We'd be blessed to give them. Oh, no problem." So they spread a garment, and each man threw the earrings of his plunder onto it. So, they got to keep plenty. They got to keep everything else except for the earrings. They got to keep any money they had or weapons they had or whatever. So they were happy to contribute the earring. So they contributed these earrings. Verse 26, the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. Now that's about 43 pounds. So Gideon's got about 43 pounds of gold to work with, but that's not all, because then it goes on to say, well, yeah, but there were the crescents and the pendants and the purple clothing that was on the king of Midian. And besides the chains, or if you will, collars that were around their camels' necks. So he got 43, pounds of gold, and there was all this other stuff too. And so what did Gideon do? He made it into an ephod. Now, ephod is a funny word because it has two very distinct meanings in Scripture. One is it was the clothing that the high priest wore. It was used for that. But another is that it was an idol We've never been able to archaeologists have never been able to discover exactly the shape of the idol. You know, what shape it was or what it was of. It's simply called an ephod, but it was obviously something that was made into an image of some kind, and it stood up. And so right after saying, Yahweh will rule over you, what does Gideon do? He makes an idol and he puts it in his city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel played the prostitute after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his house. So as we take a look at this, so Gideon makes an idol. Now, where were the priests and Levites? You know, where were the people that were supposed to be helping him kind of in a weak moment and say, hey, cut it out. You know, let's not do this. This is going to cause a lot of trouble. You know, Gideon just, people were wowed by him, and he apparently, he had a lot of strength of character, obviously. And sometimes people do things that we just need to be able to speak into their life. And in this particular case, Gideon goes off and makes this idol, and there's that people didn't have the strength of character to stand up against it. And then it says all Israel played the prostitute after it. That's an idiom, meaning that they, it's playing off the fact that in Exodus 24, when Israel made a covenant with God, it was a covenant between God and them, and it's basically a marriage covenant, which is why then God would say to Israel, you will have no other gods in my presence. This is a translation problem. I actually need to look at the REV in this, because the standard translation of the first commandment is, you will have no other gods before me. And that can be understood to mean, I don't want any God before me. In other words, to go first. I don't want to be the second God or the third God. I don't want any God ahead of me. But that's not at all what the verse means. They use that before in me in the sense of in my presence. God says, I don't want to look around and see any other gods. I want to be the one and only God. And that's exactly what Deuteronomy says with the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. I'm actually going to be teaching on this at Converge, because it is, you guys all know the Shema typically gets translated, Yahweh, well, they say the Lord, the Lord is our God, or Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. Well, it is the Hebrew word echad, which is one, but what does it mean in that context? Because, they'd never heard of the Trinity. And in fact, I just did some research on this in its background for what I'm going to teach at Converge, but I could not find, and talk to some other people that could not find a single God in any ancient pantheon that was manifested as different gods. Like, the Trinitarians say, okay, we have one God, but that one God exists in three independent persons. That's unique to Christianity. There are other cultures that have three chief gods, but they're three gods. They aren't one God. And so what happens is, when you get the Shema, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. The Hebrew, what is it? Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. So when they said Yahweh is one, they weren't saying he was one versus being many. They had absolutely zero concept of being many. In fact, if that was Moses 1450 BC, you've got to take it all the way up to about the 300s AD before they really started. In fact, actually, the Holy Spirit wasn't inculcated into the Trinitarian Godhead really until the 400s. So you've got 1700 years before people conceptualized a God that was one God but in many persons. So what were the Jews saying when they said, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad? What are they saying? Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. And that's what the first commandment was. You will have no other gods before me. I want to look around, says God, and I don't want to see anybody but me. I want to be your one and only God. And so, so here are the Israelites and Gideon, who had just said, Yahweh's going to rule over you. He just gets attracted by material things, and he builds this ephod, and then all Israel, all of a sudden, there's something in the human spirit, the humanity, that we want to worship something tangible. We want something to be there. And so he builds this thing, and the Israelites go and they start worshiping it. And because they were married to God, it says they played the prostitute, and it became a snare to Gideon into his house. Now, that, I believe, that kind of statement, obviously the prophets would understand it, because as Gideon and his household then supported the worship of more than one God, then you have the blessing of God start to be removed from the house of Gideon, just as God said would happen in the law of Moses. You and I can go a little deeper with that. And what we know is, if you have an object that is created against the will of God, such that it belongs to the devil, you cannot cleanse it. It belongs to the devil. He owns it. And wherever it is, he can come and visit it. And people don't realize that, and they get stupid about that. So, for example, let's say you go to Haiti and there's some witch doctor and he makes this really cool dragon thing to worship out of soapstone, and then he sells it to you and you bring it home. He created that to worship, and it's an image that's used of the devil. You can pray over that. You can try to cast demons out of that. You can do whatever you want to with it, and you can't make it clean. And it sits in your home, and it's basically like leaving the door open, because it's owned by the devil, and he can visit it when he wants to. And that's why God, if you go back into Torah and you read what God said in the Old Testament, and he didn't say, by the way, when it comes to all these Canaanite articles, people are going to be really interested in them in about 3,000 years. So you really ought to build museums. As much as we'd, in one sense, like to have that context to know what these things are, the fact of the matter is they're owned by the devil, and they attract demons. And so what did God say? He said, burn their wooden pillars, smash their sacred stones, smash their idols, melt down their idols of gold and silver. We're supposed to just completely get rid of those things. I try to talk to people about pornography. If you've got, there's no way to cleanse pornography. It wasn't made for a godly purpose. People have pornography in their house. It's just like inviting the devil into your house if he wants to come. Doesn't mean he will. He's got free will too. But we unwittingly bring in things into our home that allow the adversary to come in. And so here it says, that this idol became a snare. So where did that get off to? Let's see. Played the prostitute. Yeah, and it became a snare to Gideon in his house from two aspects. The blessing of God was threatened, and also the adversary was given access to his house. And then it goes to talk about Midian. So verse 28, Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, and they lifted up their head no more, meaning that the Midianites weren't going to be proud anymore. And the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. And Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, because he's called Gideon and his second name is Jerubbaal, he went to live in his own house. Verse 30, now Gideon had 70 sons conceived from his thigh, and that's literal Hebrew. Most would say loins or something like that, or came out of his body. But the The literal Hebrew is thigh, and that is a euphemism they used for the genital organs. In fact, I don't know, the King James is pretty good about this. Back in Genesis, when Abraham is having his servant swear to him about getting a son for Isaac. And Abraham, if you remember, the King James says, "Put your hand under my thigh." And that's a euphemism. In other words, basically, one of the most solemn ways you could swear in the biblical world was a man would let you hold onto his testicles. And then you would swear, and that would be a very firm oath. By the way, this is debated, but the word testicle is little witness. That's what testicle means, a little witness. And there are some grammarians, people that study the history of language, that think there's a possibility that that goes back to the custom of swearing on your testicles. But then there are other grammarians and people who say that that's not true. But anyway, that's why it says that the sons came, he had the sons conceived from his thigh because he had many wives. Verse 31, his concubine who was in Shechem, she also bore him a son. Now, if you remember, Shechem is where Jacob dug his well. That's where Jacob's well is. And so his concubine was in Shechem. She also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech, or more literally in the Hebrew, Abimelech. And I'll talk about that. But the reason, concubine, just if you're not clear on that, a concubine is a lesser wife. So if a man had multiple, that's like Solomon, he had 300 wives, 700 concubines, or whatever. So the wives they would come out of rich, powerful families or royal families, and they would be socially equal to Solomon. The concubines would usually have been either a beautiful girl that was a slave that somebody bought and presented to Solomon as a gift, or it was a family that gave a daughter to Solomon as a gift to have royal connections. So a concubine is a lesser wife. So that's what's going on. So he's got a lesser wife is in Shechem, and she bore him a son. And I love this. And Gideon, names his son Abimelech. Well, Av is father, like Avraham, father of a nation. Abi is my father. And by the way, it's important to know the I form, because, for example, we know El is God. You get Elohim. You get El. When Christ is on the cross, he says, Eli, Eli, my God, why have you forsaken me? So that's how that works. So here he is, and he names his son Abimelech. Melech is the word king. So he has this son, and what's he call his son? My father's the king. So you can see there's a little bit of a shift here going on in Gideon's heart. The first thing he says is, it's Yahweh that's going to rule over you. And then he makes an ephod, and then he says, by the way, I'm the king. But he doesn't come right out and say, I'm the king. He names his father, he names his son, my father's the king, which I think is really funny. But anyway, it's just people. Verse 33, it came to pass as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and played the prostitute after the Baals, and Baal was the primary Canaanite god, and made Baal Berith their god. And the word Berith is the Hebrew word for covenant. And this then, you can see Satan inserting himself behind the scenes. And, this will happen in our culture as well. In fact, you and I both know this is happening in modern culture today. It's happening in modern culture when it comes to sex. It happens when it comes to music, happens in various ways, the use and abuse of money, that Satan is constantly trying to wheedle his way into society. And here you see this, that the Israelites made a covenant with God. It should have been Elohim of the covenant, or Yahweh of the covenant. Instead, by the time you get here, you've gone downhill far enough in their spiritual thinking, in their ability to hang on to truth, that they're calling Baal Baal of the covenant, and they made Baal of the covenant their god, which tells you that the people around either had made or had recognized a covenant between themselves or the people around and Baal. And then, of course, the next step is the children of Israel did not remember Yahweh their God. Now, that's an idiomatic use of the word remember, where it doesn't mean they didn't remember, like somebody said, who's Yahweh? I don't know, I forgot. But it's like remember when you don't remember somebody's birthday. You don't, it's an idiomatic way of saying that the people didn't treat him the way he should have been treated. So that's what it means when it says the children of Israel did not remember Yahweh, their God, who delivered them out of the hand of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show loyalty to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good things that he had done to Israel. So now you see the children of Israel going downhill. And again, when they play the prostitute with this Baal of the covenant, Gideon was the one who opened the door for this. He said, I want Yahweh to be your God, your ruler, but then he was the one who made an ephod, and then things start spiraling downhill. And again, even in this situation, where are the Levites? A lot of times as Christians, that we don't have Levites now, but we have people. The Levites really were supposed to represent God in their culture. Well, that's what Christians are. Christ said, we're the light of the earth. We're the salt of the earth. We're the light of the world. And so we have to be willing to stand in and being in the Christian fight can be distasteful. Nobody likes being in these arguments and stuff like that. But somebody has got to stand up, and thank God for the men and women who, stand in circles against political corruption, financial corruption, moral corruption. We need to support them in prayer, and then to the extent of your personal ministry and how you are supposed to function in the body of Christ. If you're supposed to be in that arena, jump in with both feet and start swinging. And let's go to the next chapter, Judges chapter 9. And so now we're going to learn about Abimelech. And it says, Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem. Well, that's where his mother lived. She was his concubine in Shechem. So Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's brothers, and spoke with them and with all the family of the house of his mother's father, saying, please speak in the ears of all the men of Shechem. So basically, he goes to his family members and he says, you guys have some traction here with the people of Shechem. So can you talk to them, and get support? So he says, speak in the ears of all the men of Shechem, which is better for you, that all the sons of Jerubbaal, who are 70 men, rule over you, or that one man rules over you. And then he goes, remember, I'm of your bone and flesh. Hey, I'm a Shechemite. To keep that in mind while you're making your decision. And of course, verse 3, all his mother's brothers spoke all these words about him in the ears of the men of Shechem, and their hearts were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. Verse 4, so they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, which tells you, by the way, the house of Baal-berith, in many of the versions, that's going to be translated temple, because it was the temple. But it was just simply known as the house. And this is again one of the things I've tried to do in the REV is retain when the Hebrew word is house. I've tried to retain the word house because it's very important for us to make sure that we morph our thinking and really get that the temple was the house of God. In the same way that people lived in their house, their gods lived in the temple, and that's where they would go. And in this case, the fact that they can pull money out of the temple of Baal-berith means that People had been visiting the temple. People were giving gifts to the temple. They were donating money to the temple. And so they took 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, the temple of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. And it's amazing how many people there are who will do evil for money. When you read the Bible, one of the things, it's almost like, if I printed this out in a Word document, I'd print it out in 2 columns. And so I'd have the 1 column of the Bible and the 1 column blank next to it. And you can make notes, or a lot of the Bible study programs have the ability to make notes. And one of the things that you and I need to pay attention to is there's an immense number of people that will do evil for money. And we just can't be naive about that, like, oh, nobody would do that. Oh yeah, there's a lot of people that would do that. And here are these people. And so he hired worthless, reckless fellows who followed him. Verse 5, he went to his father's house at Ophrah, and he killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, being 70 persons on 1 stone. And that's really important, because I want you to think for a second. Okay, here are 70 men, and all of a sudden they are surrounded by this huge army. Now, they have a choice. Had they known what's coming, I'm sure they would fight. But even if you just went in and just slaughtered them, they would be dead everywhere. But these 70 men are killed on 1 stone. So the only way this really could have played out would be the men from Shechem surrounded the house. They were all armed with weapons. The men inside didn't know what was going on, or in the area. The 70 guys came out, surrendered, were tied up, and then they were executed on 1 stone. What would be the purpose of that? Well, the worship of Baal is Baal really, he's a god of human sacrifice. And the fact that they were executed on 1 stone points to the fact that this was actually a sacrifice to Baal. Can we prove that in the text? Not hard and fast, but that's the way Baal would operate. Otherwise, you just kill them. You wouldn't take the time to execute them on a stone. But it goes to show how evil Abimelech really was, that he would kill these 70 people on 1 stone. And then it says, but Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. Verse 6, all the lords of Shechem assembled themselves together, and all Beth Millo, and went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar that was in Shechem. So this is a holy place in Shechem. And when they told it to Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim. Now, Mount Gerizim in Israel is a very prominent mountain. And if you remember in the law of Moses, there was a place where you had half of the Israelites stand on Mount Ebal, half of the Israelites stand on Mount Gerizim, and they spoke the blessings and the cursings back and forth. And Mount Gerizim, as it goes down to Shechem, has a very, very steep face and then a very gentle slope sloping away from it. So Jotham here, if you understand the geography, could stand up on top of Mount Gerizim, shout down to Shechem. The people could hear him very clearly, but they wouldn't be able to get up to him in time that he wouldn't be able to run away. So he knows they're having this big thing down there, this coronation ceremony for Abimelech, and he goes up to the top of Mount Gerizim. He lifts up his voice and he cries out and says to them, listen to me, you lords of Shechem, that God may listen to you. And now he's going to tell them a fable. A fable is different from a parable. They're very similar. But in a parable, you have people being people and animals being animals. In a fable, the animals or whatever takes over the place of people. And so here it says in verse 8, the trees once went out to anoint a king over them. And of course, he had just said, listen to me, you lords of Shechem. And oftentimes in the scripture, a tree is used to represent a a person of prominence, a person of importance. If you remember, John the Baptist said to the Pharisees, the axe has already been laid at the root of the trees. And then he said, do the works of righteousness, lest you be cut down and thrown into the fire. So when John said the axe is already laid at the root of the trees, he was talking to the Pharisees, and he was saying, you guys, you don't realize how close you are to being cut down. You trees in the society, the axe is already laying right at your feet. And of course, they didn't listen to him, and of course, they will be cut down. So here the trees once went out to anoint a king over them. They said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, should I leave my fatness with which by me they honor God and man and go to wave back and forth over the trees? And basically, the waving back and forth is what a tree does in the wind, and it's a lot of motion and doesn't do any good. That's basically what he's saying. A lot of show, no go. Verse 10, well, then the tree said to the fig tree, come and reign over us. But the fig tree said unto them, should I leave my sweetness and my good fruit? In other words, should I leave actually being able to do something and go and wave back and forth over the trees? So then the tree said to the vine, come and reign over us. Of course, this is the grapevine. And the vine said to them, should I leave my new wine that cheers God and man and go wave back and forth over the trees? So you've got people that are productive in the society, the fig tree and the vine, and the olive tree, people that are really productive. And do people that are really productive and doing something wonderful, do they want to leave what they're doing so they can go do a kind of a nothing job that has a bunch of glitz and show but doesn't get a lot of stuff done? And he says, no, that's not the way it works. Verse 14, then all the trees said to the bramble, come and reign over us. And as far as who are the guys that study trees? But anyway, the plant people, who study the plants of the Bible, they believe this is the atat tree, basically like a bramble. It's got it doesn't do any good. It doesn't have leaves that give any kind of decent shade whatsoever. And it catches fire and burns very, very intensely, very quickly. And so verse 14, then all the trees said to the bramble, come and reign over us. The bramble said to the trees, if in truth you anoint me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade, which is exactly like an unproductive person. If the bramble was honest, it would know it didn't have any shade. But people who want political office, who want political power, who crave that kind of power, have a self-importance like, of course I have shade, even though they don't actually have any shade. This is something that we can look at in our society. Who is trying to move to the top that's basically just a no-good person that has a feeling of self-importance that it's not really even real. This stuff goes on every bit of today. And he says, and watch how vindictive he is, because the bramble says, come and take refuge in my shade. And if not, in other words, if you're not going to submit to me, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon, the most important trees in the Middle East. So the bramble here is very vindictive. If you're not going to submit to me, then bah, and all this vindictive stuff. And that is what we see in a lot of politics today. This could have been written yesterday. That people that are bramble people, it's not good enough that they believe something, that you have to believe what they believe. And if you don't believe what they believe, then they're very vindictive and they'll seek revenge. And we see this. And so verse 16, then Jotham stops his parable. He says, now therefore, if you've dealt truly and righteously, and that you've made Abimelech king, and if you've dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him according to the deserving of his hands, for my father fought for you and risked his life and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. And if you've risen up against my father's house, and you have risen up against my father's house today and have slain his sons, 70 persons on one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the men of Shechem, because he's your brother. If you then have dealt truly and righteously with Jerubbaal and his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech. And remember the atat tree, the fire that would come out of the bramble. Let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and the house of Millo. And let fire come out of the men of Shechem and from the house of Millo and devour Abimelech. Then Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and lived there away from the face of Abimelech, his brother, because obviously Abimelech probably sent a couple guys to try and kill him. So verse 22, Abimelech was ruler over Israel for 3 years. Verse 23, then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the lords of Shechem, and the lords of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Now, obviously in verse 37 or verse 23 here, when it says God sent an evil spirit, this is the idiom of permission. God didn't actually send an evil spirit, but this is the way they spoke in the Old Testament. God allowed this to happen. Actually, God couldn't even stop it. Basically, when it says God sent an evil spirit, the reason it uses the idiom of permission is because it was God who said that if you disobey me, if you have other gods, if you behave in an ungodly fashion, then you will be afflicted. And because it was God who said that, then they attribute this evil spirit coming. But what do you and I learn from this? See, we've got to look at this as more than history. What do you and I learn from this? Well, what I learned from this is if you're a person, when we look at ourselves and when we look at others, if there are people who are cruel, people who are power hungry, people who are vindictive, these are things that, for example, in the New Testament, it specifically says to get rid of. Get rid of anger and malice and wrath and evil speaking against each other and clamor. And, does God say that simply because he wants the earth to be a peaceful place? He does want the earth to be a peaceful place. But he also knows if you engage in that kind of behavior habitually and live habitually in disobedience to God, eventually you open yourself up to an evil spirit. In other words, here's this evil spirit that comes between Abimelech and the lords of Shechem, and they've both been disobeying God habitually, and eventually it's just simply it's a formula for disaster. And this becomes important for you and I in our counseling ministries, because you probably know, I know people who are very angry people. They tend to be very vindictive people, and that kind of thing. And it's not just that kind of person creeps me out. That kind of person I don't really like. I'm not going to be around that kind of person. It's not that we want to be around that kind of person, but the other side of the coin is it behooves us to pray for that kind of person and pray for opportunities to speak into their life, because if they behave that way consistently and then because of it they get, say, a demon of anger or something along that line, then that's pretty hard to shake. You just don't say, okay, I don't want to be angry anymore, and it goes away. Then it becomes pretty hard to shake. And this is where you and I, we read the Old Testament and we're mining the depth of it. We're drilling in, okay, God, this isn't just, it is a historical fact that a demon entered the situation. But how did the demon enter? Why did the demon enter? How does that affect my life? How does that guide me in my ministering to others? What am I looking out for? How can I help others? That kind of thing. And so this evil spirit came, and because of the blood guilt and stuff like that. And so then there's a fight between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, verse 25. So the lords of Shechem set an ambush for him on top of the mountains, and they robbed all who came along the road by them, and it was told Abimelech. Now I love this, verse 26. Then Gaal, the son of Ebed, actually it's Gaal, then Gaal, like Baal. We say Baal, this you'd say Gaal, but it's really Gaal and it's really Baal. Then Gaal, the son of Ebed, came with his brothers and went over to Shechem. And just seeing the name, what God is doing here is he's I doubt the guy's name was Gaal, son of Ebed, by the way. I don't think that's his real name, because Gaal means worthless, and Ebed is the Hebrew word for slave. So the guy's name was this worthless son of a slave. Well, no mother is going to name her kid, hey, what's my name? Worthless son of slave. What it's doing is it's letting you in to the kind of character this man is. So he's a worthless son of a slave. That's the label, if you will, that God gives him here. So then, worthless son of slave came with his brothers and went over to Shechem, and then it says, and the men of Shechem put their trust in him. Great. You can see, you're reading this in the Hebrew text. It's like, really? The worthless son of slave shows up and you trust him? And you can begin to see, just the lack of judgment, and also how evil people will use other people for their own interests. And the demons in one set of people will work with the demons in another set of people. You see this on the face of the earth today. You'll see different groups that are influenced by demons, and somehow or other they hate Christians when we don't hate them, but they don't hate each other. And it's like, wait a minute, what's wrong with this picture? But the demons are playing behind the scenes. And here, the men of Shechem, they've got demons running around with them. Gaal, worthless son of slave, you'll see very quickly he's playing with demons too. Those demons, they just mesh, they get together, boom, move forward. So he goes to Shechem, they put their trust in him. Verse 27, they went out into the field and harvested their vineyards, trod the grapes, held a festival, and went into the house of their God. That's the temple of their God. So they went into the temple of Baal Berith and ate and drank and cursed Abimelech. Great. What do we do in the temple of God? Christ says, bless and curse not. If you're power hungry, you've got avarice, you've got greed, you've packed demons, you get together in the house of your God and you curse people. That still goes on, obviously, today. There's a lot of people, for example, in witch covens and whatever, that specifically get together and curse people like you and me. And we need to be aware of that. Thankfully, Proverbs says the curse that doesn't have a cause won't land. And so that's one of the reasons we want to keep our lives straight. So verse 28, and Gaal, the son of Ebed, Gaal, the son of Ebed, said, who is Abimelech and who is Shechem that we should serve him? Isn't he the son of Jerubbaal? And Zebul, his officer, served the men of Habor, the father of Shechem, but why should we serve him? Would that this people were under my hand, and then I would remove Abimelech. I would say to Abimelech, increase your army and come out. So he's talking real big. And so when Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, the son of Ebed, his anger was kindled. And he sent messengers to Abimelech secretly, saying, behold, Gaal, the son of Ebed, and his brothers have come to Shechem, and behold, they incite the city against you. Now therefore go up by night, you and the people who are with you, and lie and wait in the field. And in the morning, as soon as the sun is up, you are to rise early and rush on the city, and behold, when he and the people who are with him come out against you, then you may do to them as you will find occasion. And that's interesting, because then Zebul inside the city had finally had enough. And so now he's communicating with Abimelech. And so verse 35, and watch how this plays out. Gaal, the son of Ebed, went out and stood at the entrance of the gate of the city. So this is the next morning. He gets up and he stands in the gate of the city, kind of looking out over things. And Abimelech rose up, and the people who were with him from the ambush. And Gaal saw the people and said to Zebul, behold, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains. And look at how Zebul just plays this off and kind of buys the Abimelech's army some time. It says, Gaal said, what did he say? Verse 36, you see the shadow of the mountains as if they were men. And Gaal probably said, yeah, maybe you're right. The mountains, these shadows are falling and stuff. But then it was finally 37, Gaal spoke, look, people are coming down by the middle of the land. And one company comes up by the way of the oak of Menonaim. And Zebul said, where's your mouth now, you who said, who is Abimelech, that we should serve him? Is this not the people for whom you've shown contempt? Now go out and fight them. And Gaal went out before the lords of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him, and many fell wounded even as far as the entrance of the gate. And so the story, the story goes on, and we'll just keep reading a little bit. So basically, Abimelech wins the war. Verse 46. When all the men of the tower of Shechem heard it, they entered into the stronghold of the house of El-Berith. So here's now a different name. Instead of calling him the Baal of the covenant, Baal of the covenant, Baal-Berith, they're calling him El-Berith, the God of the covenant. So in the temple of this God, there was a stronghold, a place where they could be protected. And it was reported to Abimelech that all the men of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people who were with him, and Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bough from the trees, picked it up, laid it on his shoulders, and said to the people who were with him, what you've seen me do, make haste and do as I have done. So all the people each cut down his bough and followed Abimelech and put them at the base of the stronghold and set the stronghold on fire over them, so that all the people of the tower of Shechem died also, about 1,000 men and women. So they died by fire. Remember Jotham's prophecy? He said, may fire come out of Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem. And, he spoke it as a parable, but a prophecy, and here the prophecy comes to pass. Meanwhile, Abimelech, not satisfied yet, went to Thebez, encamped against Thebez and took it. But there was a strong tower inside the city, and all the men and women fled there, and all the leaders of the city, and shut themselves in and went up on the roof of the tower. And Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it and drew near to the door of the tower to burn it with fire. Verse 53, but a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and broke his skull. Verse 54, and again, see, that's for him to get close enough to the tower to be hit by a stone, shows just really unclear thinking, overconfidence, all the stuff that, we're supposed to develop, the patience, the love, the concern, thinking clearly, and because we're in a battle every day. We just fight a different kind of battle, but here Abimelech was overconfident, and he charged this tower, and the woman just throws a stone on him, hits him in the head, crushes his skull. Verse 54, and he called hastily to the young man who was an armor bearer and said to him, draw your sword and kill me, so that men do not say of me, a woman killed him. The thing that's so funny about that is that years later with David, if you remember with David and Joab, and when David had Uriah killed, then David said, don't you remember about Abimelech and the woman who killed him? So Abimelech here was trying to protect his reputation, but it didn't do any good. So he said, draw your sword and kill me, so that men do not say of me, a woman killed him. His young man thrust him through, and he died. When the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed every man to his place. That's an interesting lesson too. The demon, God needs leaders and the devil needs leaders. And if God's leaders don't step forward, a lot of God's work doesn't get done. And if the devil's leaders can be stopped, a lot of the devil's work will fall apart. Leaders, the Bible divides people into sheep and shepherds, and that goes for both God's army and the devil's army. And to be able to recognize who the leaders are and help and support the godly leaders and figure out who the ungodly leaders are and figure out how to get them stopped is really important to see God's purposes accomplished on earth. And by Abimelech dying that way, verse 56 says, thus God returned the evil of Abimelech that he did to his father in killing his 70 brothers. And all the evil of the men of Shechem did, God returned on their heads. And on them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. And now all of a sudden you hear Jotham's prophecy as a curse because it went out and it did its work. And in this particular case, the work was to the destruction of Abimelech and the men of Shechem. So here's a record, when we read it through, it can be just read as a historical record. And the first few times you're reading it, like any other record in the scripture, you're kind of embedding the information in your brain and kind of getting the story down. And then after you get the story down and the facts of the case, if you will, then you go back and you start asking God, okay, God, show me what's going on here. How can I apply this to my life? What are the spiritual principles? Who are the players? What's God doing? What's the devil doing? What are angels doing? What are demons doing? How can human beings play into the situation? And this is a great record for that, because there's so much interplay between good people like Jotham, bad people like Abimelech, demons getting involved, and that kind of thing. So it's a really powerful record to help us understand. And I think, boy, a huge lesson is that God and the devil both need leaders. We need to support God's leaders and pray that the devil's leaders are stopped somehow, because that will help to put the kibosh on his kingdom. So that's what I wanted to share tonight, and I appreciate you guys being here.